Welcome back. Memory. To put the basics of our memory in the proper context, we will sandwich it between discussion of spreading activation and schemas. One thing we should get right if we want to understand how we understand things is our key metaphors. An assumption that I hold is that we should want our metaphors for thinking or understanding to be analogous to the biology of thinking itself. Thinking is accomplished by your billions of neurons using their trillions of connections organized by their having fired together on previous occasions. The brain is 3 pounds of semi-organized neurons that somehow perform the miracle that is your mind. Alternative options to aligning our metaphor with biology would include a purer information processing type of approach where the analogy is, instead of biology, a computer. But our brains are not computers. Typing the word orgasm or fellatio into my word processor does not start a bunch of subroutines that distract it from the rest of the words I'm typing. Or we could use a semantic type of approach where the analogy that we use isn't biology, isn't a computer, it's a set of definitional relations between the names of objects that we're thinking about. But of course our brains aren't dictionaries. So saying the word mother conjures quite different thoughts in different people, or quite different thoughts in the same person at different times in their lives. This is why the lecture on memory opens with the concept of spreading activation. What we are really interested in when we're asking questions about our memory is how neural activation spreads or fails to spread across the networks that house and do not house our prior learning, knowledge, or experience. If you do not remember something, it could be the case that you never made the appropriate connections, so there's either no there, meaning there's no memory to activate, or no way to get there from here, meaning no activation route sufficient to activate the memory. Or it could be the case that the connections are there, but your attempts at activation of them are insufficient. So this could mean a wrong route that leads to an incorrect recall, or a wrong route that can't find the proper activation pathways. In any case, what's really of interest is the activation and spread of associations across our 3 pounds of meat. But the structure of the 3 pounds of meat turns out to be important for this process of activation. So this lecture reviews some memory structure basics. It's my hope that it'll be somewhat intuitive to you to think in terms of the spreading activation of neurons, or to think about thinking in terms of the spreading activation of neurons. Maybe we're trying to think of something that we know, but we just can't remember. So we're trying to activate the bits of our neural network that contain that information, combining factual information like her name was a common millennial Canadian name with auditory information. It went da-da-da, da-da-da. It's a common Canadian millennial name. It went da-da-da. It's not Madeline. Madison. It was Madison. So in this example, we're spreading our neural activation through common millennial female names, while also spreading neural activation through 3-syllable names, hoping that the neurons that house the woman's name will be activated. If we could add a third bit of information from which to spread activation, so maybe her name sounded high class like Madison Avenue, then we would have an even better chance of hitting the original memory trace. Another example, maybe we're trying to solve a problem that we're pretty sure is solvable. We're trying to activate relevant bits of our neural network in the hopes that they'll put a solution together. So we need to attach 2 things together, a plastic toy skid steer and its bucket. What are some attachment solutions that I could simulate? So string, screws, twist ties, zip ties, duct tape, glue. In this example, we're spreading our neural activation through what we know about the objects that we're affixing to each other. We're also spreading our neural activation through what we know about the methods of affixing. Duct tape is wrong for the plastic, but the plastic isn't strong enough for the screws, etc. We're not generally handling one idea at a time. Our thinking is a bit more of a mess than that. Now, it may seem like spreading activation or 3 pounds of meat, like these metaphors, are somehow disparaging our thinking. but it's just trying to represent it faithfully. A problem does not become less solved by admitting that the path to the solution is a nonlinear or a messy one. Our respect for a solution need not be diminished by knowledge of how that solution came about. To explain spreading activation, we should start with where it came from. Cognitive scientists were trying to explain some research findings. First of all, these approaches have a basal or a fundamental assumption, which is if it takes people longer to answer a question, that means they had to think about it more or perform more processing of information. If you reject that basal assumption, then information processing theory, and probably most of cognitive science in general, is probably not for you. That said, here's what the cognitive scientists / information processing theorists were trying to explain. On a semantic association task where we ask questions like, is a robin a bird? People respond quicker to certain types of questions than they do to others. People answer quickest if we ask, is a robin a robin? Yeah, it's a robin. A robin's a robin. The average response time is about 1 second flat. People also answer quickly if they're asked the question, is a robin a bird? Average response time there is 1.2 seconds. If we ask people, is a bird an animal? Then they also answer quickly, again, about 1.2 seconds. Yet if we ask, is a robin an animal? They take longer to respond. Average response time is 1.3 seconds, so 1/10 of a second longer on average. This suggests that more thinking has to occur to come to the conclusion that a robin is an animal, rather than to come to the conclusion that the robin is a bird. The first crack at explaining why this happens, which was made in the late 1960s, was to say that our brains work by storing hierarchical networks that model reality. Animal is very high or general or superordinate of a category. It's the more general superordinate category to which the robin belongs. Bird is the more basic or common or ordinary category to which the robin belongs. This is the word that most people would use if they pointed and they said, look, it's a bird. So it's a common level. And then robin is the more specific or subordinate or feature-specific category to which the robin belongs. But there are, of course, also different types of robins. So you have male, female, adult and juvenile. This is a European robin, and there's Indian robins. So there are subordinate categories as well, but those are typically the domains of experts or specialists. So with this hierarchy idea, cognitive psychologists explained the response time difference by saying that it takes the mind longer to move from the subordinate category level to the superordinate category level, because that's a jump of 2 levels, than it does to move from the subordinate to the basic or from the basic to the superordinate. More mental space has to be traversed to process the answer. Some other examples include it takes an average of 0.89 seconds to answer that a pear is a fruit, but 1.16 seconds to say that a pear is food. It takes an average of 1.07 seconds to answer that a willow is a tree, and 1.29 seconds to answer that it is a plant. It takes 1.28 seconds to answer that a minute is a unit of time, but 1.55 seconds to answer that a minute is a unit of measurement. So this was the model of the brain, or of the mind, or of the information processor that explained the time difference findings. The conclusion was that our minds are organized a lot like a Linnaean taxonomy. So we start our thinking at a level of category membership, some level of category membership, and we're quicker at processing or thinking about the category levels closest to the category level where our thinking began. This hierarchical network model was a good first draft, but there were a lot of findings that it couldn't explain. First, the response time effect only held for some nouns. For example, participants took the same amount of time to identify a daisy as a plant as they did to identify a daisy as a flower, 1.0 seconds in both cases. Second, there were some cases where it took more time to move 2 levels than to move 1. An example was that it takes people longer to answer, is a chimpanzee a primate, than it does to answer, is a chimpanzee an animal? Another example was that it takes people longer to answer that scotch is a liquor than it does to answer that scotch is a drink. The third thing the model couldn't explain, or at least it had no explanation for, was why it takes us longer to classify some nouns than others. We answer, is a robin a bird, more quickly than is a penguin a bird. And we have trouble with odd creatures like bats, whales, and ostriches. This third observation is called the typicality effect. The observation is that some members of the category are more typical or normative for that category than others. Typical cases like robins for birds, Labradors for dogs, and inches for units of measurement are processed more quickly than others. This led cognitive psychologists to think that maybe we're processing things in terms of their features. Feature comparison models tried to account for the results by saying that we match things to categories by assessing their features. The category bird has, by definition, a list of defining features that a creature must have in order to be a bird. So it breathes, it has wings, it has a beak or a bill, etc. And categories will also have typical or characteristic features that tend to be present but are not by definition necessary for the category. So the ability to fly and sing and migrate, etc. for birds. This model does better at explaining some things, like why, for example, it takes so long for people to answer that a bat is not a bird, because it has lots of features in common with birds. That's why it takes longer to answer that it's not a bird. But this model does not seem like a good model for how our thinking actually works. It posits that we do massive amounts of comparative information processing and that we know the defining features of categories. How many of us would agree with the notion that we answer the question, is a pug a dog, by comparing the features of a pug to those of the semantic category of dog and cat and hamster and pig, etc. A simple association model, pug has been paired with dog, and therefore I know that it's a dog, would be far more parsimonious. And we would likely have to admit that doing the feature computation work is not necessary in most cases. I just know that a pug is a dog. There'd be some exceptions, probably, for things like bats and dolphins. Another criticism of the feature comparison model comes from research from the 70s and 80s, which found that processing in terms of the defining features is actually more characteristic of older adults. For most thinkers, especially kids, processing is actually done in terms of characteristic features, which are the features that aren't required for category membership. So feature comparison is likely a strategy that we use when we have a difficult case in front of us, so a duck-billed platypus. But it's a poor model and a computationally exhausting / impossible one for ordinary thinking. This leads us to a model that was a deliberate combination of the hierarchical network and the feature comparison model's spreading activation theory, which says that triggering a concept triggers other associated concepts. How associated is bat with bird? How many associative paths lead from the idea of a bat to the idea of a bird? The number and strength of these associative paths will determine whether and how quickly one goes from thinking about bats to thinking about birds. So you have some concept of bat or some concept of a feature of bat, and it's linked by association to bird or some concept or feature of bird. Here, the number of associative paths is akin to the number of common features, as with feature comparison approaches, and the strength of these associative paths is akin to the distance between category levels from the hierarchical network approach. But we've opened up far more than just a better model for semantic association mappings. We now have a model that mimics our messy neural networks and can account for things like our unique associative learning experience. If you grew up with a cat named Dog, this model can explain how your thinking or your concepts or your categories, etc., would be different. We were actually stealthily introduced to spreading activation in the last lecture. Recall from the last lecture that priming, which is activation of an idea or feeling that colors or influences later experience, thinking, and deciding. Priming only needs to activate some part of the idea's network, some part of the schema that the idea is associated with. So clouds are associated closely enough with comfort. Cloud, fluffy, soft, comfortable, that seeing them made research participants seeing the clouds made research participants spend more time searching comfort features of sofas. Now, in order to show you how activation spreads through your memory, what follows are 4 brief demonstrations. Students can watch without actually doing the activity, but here's your warning. If you choose not to follow along with the activity, you can't go back in time and experience it after knowing the results. Much of the content of this course is designed to show you how your thinking works, but that can only really be accomplished with your participation. Otherwise, I'm just telling you how your thinking works. And that tends to trigger what we call counter will. Right, but how well do you know you? Would you like to find out? Here's an exercise. Step 1 is to get a writing tool ready. It can be a pencil and paper. It can be notepad on your computer. We're going to be writing down recalled words. First, we'll have 2 instances of the free recall condition. And these lists that you write down will get to do double duty later on when we test for other effects. For each list, I'm going to say some words, and then I'm going to give you the signal.
At my signal.
That's when you write down the words that you can recall. List number 1. Table. Sit. Legs. Seat. Couch. Desk. Recliner. Sofa. Wood. Cushion. Swivel. Stool. Sitting. Rocking. Bench. And write down all you can remember. List 2. Door, glass, pane, shade, ledge, sill, house, open, curtain, frame, view, breeze, sash, screen, shutter. Write down all you can recall. The next 2 lists are recognition conditions. So you won't have to write out all the ones you can remember. You will just have to say yes or no to whether a few options that I present to you were on the original list or not. So we'll listen to the words, we'll wait for a list to appear, and then from the list we will say yes or no to each item as to whether or not it was in the original list. List 3. Nose, breathe, sniff, aroma, hear, see, nostril, whiff, scent, reek, stench, fragrance, perfume, salts, rose. From the list that you just heard, was each word on the list, yes or no? Just like last time. List 4. Hot, snow, warm, winter, ice, wet, frigid, chilly, heat, weather, freeze, air, shiver, Arctic, frost. Was each of these words said, yes or no? How do you think you did? These memory tasks are called DRM tasks or Dease-Roediger-McDermott tasks. The answers and purpose of the task will now be revealed, so if you haven't done the exercise, this is your point of no return. List 1. Check your recall. Here's the list of words. How many did you nail? How many did you miss? And did you write chair? 54% of participants erroneously write chair, and in my experience, they're quite convinced that they heard chair. Now, it should be intuitively obvious, looking at this list of words, why such a specific mistake is so commonly made. These words activate pretty much all of the conceptual space surrounding chair. So when we attempt to recall what we're hearing, chair is a pretty plausible thing to remember. Brain imaging shows that our brains look the same when we mistakenly recall chair as they do when we correctly recall the other words. The only exception is a small absence of activity in the auditory cortex, since you did not actually hear chair. List 2. Check your recall. How well did you do? And before I give you the target word we were trying to get you to erroneously recall, what do you think it is? Is it on your list? 65% of participants erroneously write window and are quite convinced that they heard window. And as you can see, we have window pretty well surrounded in terms of the concepts that we've activated here. Next, in the list 3 and list 4 condition, the recognition condition, we get a little bit of a boost in our power to implant a false memory, because this is what we're doing. We're implanting false memories. This is because we don't have to get you to conjure the memory for the specific word yourself. Rather, we get a chance to suggest it to you. So check your answers. The question is, was it on the list for each word? Here are the correct answers. How did you do? And what did you say to smell? 84% of participants answer that smell was on the original list and are quite convinced that it was. If I haven't implanted a false memory in you yet, and you are participating, then you are an exception. I got one more chance to do so. Here's list 4. You can check your answers. Here are the correct answers. What did you say to cold? 84% of participants answer that cold was on the original list, and again are quite convinced that it was. At this point, assuming you did all 4 tasks, and making a few other assumptions, there is less than a 1% chance that you made it through all 4 of these lists without making one of the target mistakes. That is, without falsely recalling chair, window, smell, or cold. More specifically, the estimated chance of no target error here is actually 0.41%, and in the probability lecture I'll show you how to make that type of calculation.
Never tell me the odds.
We'll come back to the topic of memory errors, explainable by spreading activation in the memory weaknesses section. Memory has 3 basic structures. You have sensory memory, long-term, and short-term memory. Information flow goes from sensory memory to short-term memory and hopefully to long-term memory. And then when we are recalling information, whether on purpose or not, information is moving from long-term memory to short-term memory. Sensory memory is our near-perfect or near-total recall immediately following exposure. So if I show you an image briefly and then remove it, a trace is left for a second or 2 afterwards. So I can ask you, who was in the foreground? Cap and Tony. Where was Hawkeye's arrow? Who was he shooting at? Was Spider-Man in the image? These are increasingly difficult questions, but in the second or 2 after getting what is called the iconic trace, you can likely answer them, even with very brief presentation of the image, providing you know who the characters are. A sensory memory store that you're more likely to have noticed yourself using is your echoic store, your auditory sensory memory. You may have noticed that you have the ability to tune something out or ignore it, but still reattend to it and play back some of what you were ignoring. Like your visual sensory memory, this trace decays quickly, but is near perfect for the brief seconds immediately after you heard something. Aside from attending or orienting to what is in your sensory memory, there's not much you can do to improve your sensory memory. We have a better chance of seeing and influencing our memory processes when it comes to short-term memory. The sensory memory that gets attended to makes its way into short-term memory, even though we tend to mean something else when we say short-term memory in conversations with our friends. What psychologists mean by short-term memory is something that typically lasts for only 20 seconds. Working memory helps us craft text messages or write emails when simulating what we want to say. Once you decide on the ending of the sentence, you can look back in your mind at the beginning of it and then start typing. The beginning is in your working memory store as long as you don't get distracted. If someone tells you their name is Manjuramiana Shlobanitzian or Edina Menzel, you might be able to repeat Manjuramiana's full name back to her in the 20 seconds after hearing it, but two processes are going to push it out of your working memory quite quickly. The first is decay. As with sensory memory, working memory decays as a simple function of time. The second is interference, such as that which occurred when I said Edina Menzel right after that person's name, which you may or may not now be able to recall. We can try to beat decay and interference through rehearsal. Maintenance rehearsal tends to involve simple repetition of the thing you don't want to lose from working memory. Manjuramiana Shlobanitzian, Manjuramiana Shlobanitzian, Manjuramiana Shlobanitzian, Manjuramiana Shlobanitzian. This might help you keep the name available for longer, but it's generally the second kind of rehearsal, elaborative rehearsal, that helps you get the name from short-term memory into long-term memory. These strategies tend to seem a bit absurd at first, but to elaborate on Manjuramiana Shlobanitzian, I might break down the sounds into other associations. Manjuramiana Shlobanitzian. Man, jury, mania, which is like Miana. So now I'm picturing a crazed all-male jury in a jury box. Okay, man, jury, mania, and Shlobanitzian. The jury members are slobbering, they're foaming at the mouth, and moving in slow motion, slow, while Big Ben, the clock in London, slowly bends down, opening a giant mouth to eat Ian, which is the name of one of the crazed jurors. So, Manjuramiana Shlobanitzian. The point of elaborative rehearsal is to create more of a memory trace for later. If you cannot recall the whole name, maybe you can recall Big Ben, slow motion, men, jurors, and hopefully put together from the traces that were memorable to you. Yes, this process is exhausting, and it's prone to pretty terrible errors, but it is one that, at least according to memory athletes, we get better at with practice. A good model for working memory is the multi-component model put forward by Badley in a 2000 paper called The Episodic Buffer. Basically, studies where people have to do two things at once suggest that there are two roughly separate parts of working memory. If we divide tasks into phonological, meaning sound or word-based tasks, and visuospatially based tasks, like navigating, searching, or recalling locations, we find that simultaneous performance on two tasks that use the same system, that is, two phonological tasks or two visuospatially based tasks, will not be as good or effective as simultaneous performance on two tasks where one is auditory and one is visuospatial. The two systems appear to be separate. An example should make this intuitive. If you're trying to memorize a phone number and I ask you the names of your family members while you're trying to do this, the second task is going to get in the way of the first. If you're trying to memorize that phone number and I ask you to find a jar of pickles in the basement, the second task is less likely to interfere. Since most of what we're trying to improve when it comes to our memory tends to be phonological, like recall of names, what people say in conversation, a phone number, it is often good advice to tell people looking to improve their memory performance to visualize things. People who compete in memory tournaments tend to report that they make sure to add not just images, but moving images or movement in their images, like Big Ben bending down to eat Ian, to make sure that it gets into and back out of long-term memory. Essentially, you can do more thinking, more encoding, more making of associations and traces if you use both systems. Baddeley's episodic buffer is where all of this thinking comes together, where System 1 automatic processes and System 2 control-based processes meet. Interestingly, Baddeley didn't at first have automatic processes in his model, so he actually had no need for an episodic buffer. What he had done was he had left responsibility for using and combining all these working memory resources to this central executive. So it was something akin to a System 2 only model, and it wasn't until later drafts that he brought things more in line with the dual process model that we have now. The real killer of short-term memory is interference. Short-term memory's first job is to attend to potentially important things before they're lost from sensory memory. Its second job is to keep us on task, but its first job often takes priority. For the most part, working memory decides what is important for us, and it's biased toward attending to changes. Yes, I would really like to retain Menjura Miana Shlobanitzian's name, but shutting out everything else to rehearse and to elaborate her name is not necessarily a good decision. A lot could happen that I might need to attend to, and it could be more important than her name. Most of us have experienced what my students tend to call the doorway effect. You walk through a doorway and forget why you walked into the new room. This happens especially when the reason for entering the new room is not your typical reason for being in that room. What makes doorways special is that they present a new scene to us. Since the first job of your short-term memory is to attend to potentially important things and it prioritizes change, the dramatic change of scenery prompts your working memory to attend to the new scene. So your working memory fails in its secondary job, which was keeping you on task, the task that you were attempting to accomplish by entering the room, but it prioritizes its first task. So it's a success from the perspective of your working memory, because it said, hey, look, there's a whole bunch of new things in this room you have to attend to. The useful term for this is event boundary. So whether these are spatial, like doorways, or temporal, like a school bell sounding, event boundaries are cues that tell us one thing has ended and another is beginning.
And that's the end of that chapter.
Long-term memory would include your memories from your grade 6 graduation, how to ride a bike, or your memory for whether Captain America was in the left or the right half of the image I showed earlier. In either case, it would be something that you have to retrieve from a store other than your sensory or working memories. By all accounts, the capacity of long-term memory is infinite, despite some people's tendency to joke that they don't have room in their head to learn new things. A famous example of the limited room idea. Arthur Conan Doyle had Sherlock Holmes in A Study in Scarlet refuse to learn that the Earth orbited the sun because, and quoting, a man's brain originally is like a little empty attic, and you have to stock it with such furniture as you choose. End quote. There is, of course, some wisdom here in the call to be discerning, but there's no practical limit to long-term memory in terms of space. Your brain will make or strengthen the connections that use of them implies it needs. Long-term memory has fairly distinct subdivisions, but there are two types of interference that apply to all of the subtypes of long-term memory. Retroactive interference, which is when something new that you learn overwrites or interferes with some previous learning. This has happened to me with my postal codes. I cannot remember my prior postal codes. They are a mess or a jumble, nor can I remember my prior phone numbers. Proactive interference is when earlier learning harms new learning. So maybe you have overlearned your prior personal identification number so well that when you go to put in your new personal identification number, your fingers and your motor memory will put in your old one, or you'll remember your old one instead. Or maybe you learned an inferior way to do something, but even though you know better now, you still have some automatic tendency to revert to the first incorrect way you used to do things. An example might be learning to type. If you have figured out a kind of halfway to good way to type, it might be very difficult to find the discipline to learn the proper advanced typing method. So both retroactive and proactive interference tend to be more likely the more your prior learning is similar to your new learning, or the more the thing that you have to learn about is similar to a previous thing. Let's now take a look at the two types of interference in one of my favorite examples.
He had built a special bicycle and he wanted me to try to ride it. He had only changed one thing. When you turn the handlebar to the left, the wheel goes to the right. When you turn it to the right, the wheel goes to the left. You can see that I'm laughing, but I'm actually really frustrated. In this moment, I had a really deep revelation. My thinking was in a rut. This bike revealed a very deep truth to me. I had the knowledge of how to operate the bike, but I did not have the understanding. Look, I know what you're probably thinking. Destin's probably just an uncoordinated engineer and can't do it. But that's not the case at all. The algorithm that's associated with riding a bike in your brain is just that complicated. I do not make definitive statements that often, but I'm telling you right now, you cannot ride this bicycle. I stayed out here in this driveway and I practiced about 5 minutes every day. My neighbors made fun of me. I had many wrecks, but after 8 months, it was like I could feel some kind of pathway in my brain that was now unlocked. It was really weird though. It's like there's this trail in my brain, but if I wasn't paying close enough attention to it, my brain would easily lose that neural path and jump back onto the old road it was more familiar with. Any small distractions at all, like a cell phone ringing in my pocket, would instantly throw my brain back to the old control algorithm and I would wreck. But at least I could ride it. My son is the closest person to me genetically, and he's been riding a normal bike for 3 years. That's over half his life. I wanted to know how long it would take him to learn how to ride a backwards bike, so I told him if he learned how to ride a backwards bike, he could go with me to Australia and meet a real astronaut. Are you gonna give up?
No.
Go ahead. This is how it starts. Look at this. This is such a big deal. Get up, you got it. Did you see his brain get it? So in how many weeks have we been doing this? 2 weeks? In 2 weeks, he did something that took me 8 months to do. Well, the question is, can I ride a normal bike now? I mean, I've spent all this time unlearning how to ride a bike. If I go back and try to ride a normal one, will my brain mess up? It's backwards, it's backwards. This was one of the most frustrating moments of my life. I had ridden a normal bike since I was 6, but in this moment, I couldn't do it anymore. I had set out to prove that I could free my brain from a cognitive bias. But at this point, I'm pretty sure that all I proved is that I could only redesignate that bias. After 20 minutes of making a fool out of myself, suddenly my brain clicked back into the old algorithm. I can't explain it, but it happened in a very specific moment. I got it. I'm back. Oh, it clicked. Hold on, it clicked. I got it. Okay, there it is. There was the moment. Okay, I can ride a bike. I learned that knowledge does not equal understanding, and I learned that truth is truth, no matter what I think about it. So be very careful how you interpret things, because you're looking at the world with a bias, whether you think you are or not.
Riding a bike is an example of implicit procedural memory. Implicit memory is memory that cannot be proven by stating it. Explicit memory is also called declarative memory because you can prove you have it by talking. I can say, I know the capital of France, and then prove it by saying Paris is the capital of France. I'm free to say that I can ride a bike, or a backwards bike, and even outline the physics involved with the help of free body diagrams, but the proof or demonstration is in something other than talking. I would have to do something to prove that I have the memory. Examples for these different subtypes of implicit memory include, for procedural, you have tying your shoelaces. For priming, you have being startled by a shadow after watching a scary movie. For conditioning, feeling nauseous when you smell sushi because some made you sick last month. And habituation, you might cease to smell something after being exposed to it for a few minutes.
Eliminate odors you've gone nose blind to for up to 30 days with the Febreze Car Vent Clip.
And examples for the two types of explicit or declarative memory include, for semantic, knowing the definition of metonymy, or knowing who the 4th Prime Minister of Canada was. For episodic, knowing the names of your second grade teachers or what you had for supper yesterday. Those rare individuals with what is called hypermnesia have near perfect recall for events of their lives after roughly puberty.
I have total recall of every day of my life since 1985.
Let's move back in time now to 1990. It rained on several days in January and February. Can you name the dates on which it rained?
It was slightly rainy and cloudy on January 14th, 15th.
Their memory is very much like your and my memory of yesterday.
So no tricks.
There's no tricks. And they just say, it just happens, just like that.
At last count, researchers had found about 20 of these individuals. And it's important to note that the same processes or tricks we use to implant false memories in normal individuals also work on these individuals. Their brains are still composed of neural networks and 3 messy pounds of meat that thinks. They just have a gift built on top of that. Since most of us do not have hyperthymesia, we can expect to find in our recall of events 3 things. A primacy effect, where we remember what was presented first or earlier. A recency effect, where we remember what was presented last or more recently. And a novelty effect called the von Restorff effect, where we recall unique things that somehow stand out. Did you observe these effects for List 1 and List 2 in the Diess-Rodinger-McDermott task? In other words, did you recall the first few words and the last few words? I don't know if any of these words are novel enough to provide a von Restorff effect. The red arrow is just there to tell you the order in which words were read. So table, sit, legs, seat were the first 4. And how about for list 2? It's the primacy effect that tends to be largest, both in the research and when I do this in classroom. You could put this another way, and rather than point out the primacy effect and the recency effect, you could say that there's a trough effect, or a weak point, which is the middle of the temporal series. Another place where I saw this effect was in running IQ tests for Women's College and Sunnybrook Hospital. This is the digit span section from the WISC-4, the Wechsler Intelligence Scales for Children. How it works is I'll tell the child, okay, we're going to do a new task now. I'm going to say some numbers, and then when I'm done saying them, I want you to say them back to me just like I said them. 2, 9. And they'll say 2, 9 in most cases. One of the keys to performing this effectively is the gap between numbers. So 2, 9. The time between the numbers should be roughly the same amount of time that it takes to say the numbers. So like 2, 2, 9, 2, 9. By far the most common type of error in the mostly 6 and 7-year-olds that I tested was the inversion of 2 middle numbers or the omission of one of the middle numbers, especially for the first item in 4. So we have 8, 4, 2, 3, 9, and then the child would hopefully say 8, 4, 2, 3, 9. What I often would get was 8, 4, 2, 3, 9 became 8, 4, 3, 2, 9 for many kids. And for item 5, 7, 9, 6, 4, 8, 3 would become 7, 9, 4, 8, 3 or 7, 9, 6, 8, 3. So they omitted a number. So the errors tended to be in the neglected middle. Interestingly, one would think that this task would be entirely a phonological one, but there's cases of individuals with impairments in their phonological systems performing normally on digit span tasks. You yourself could likely turn this digit span test into a visuospatial task for you by picturing big 3D anthropomorphic numbers standing in driveways of buildings along your street. So there's a 2 at the first house on your street. It's a 2 picking up poo. There's a 9 at the next house. And the 9 has a Hitler mustache. 9. A 7 is at the next house and it's playing a slot machine. So with visualization, you could turn this into a visuospatial task. So that the spatial aspect or the organizing aspect is that they are in order, just like the houses that you're familiar with along your street. Yes, this would be exhausting, but it would leave a heck of a trace, provided you can visualize things quick enough. But of course, recalling digits is quite a specific task, so let's look at some more general memory concerns. Memory weaknesses. First off, this is what happens around us. We can only perceive so much of what happens around us. Let's be really generous and let's say that we could potentially perceive half of what happens around us. So this is true for our visual field. Let's say it's also true for our auditory system. We have half of potentially perceptible things perceived and half forgotten or, never perceived to begin with. So forget is in quotation marks. But of course, if I can see half of everything around me, I can't attend to all that I see. So let's cut that in half and let's say, well, I can only attend to roughly half of what I see or half of what I can perceive. So I'm going to increase by another 50% what I forget. But of course, attention is one thing and interest is another. So for want of a more universal term, let's say I can only be interested in half of what I attend to. That means I'm going to forget the things that I wasn't interested in, so my forget portion grows again. But then, of course, I can't make memories out of everything that I happen to be interested in part because I might not have the schema or the organizational associative networks for it. If some of what I'm interested in is being said in Japanese and I don't speak Japanese, well, I'm not going to be able to remember phonetically everything perfectly. I just don't have the schema for storing that. So being really generous, this is roughly the ratio of what we forget to what we can make memories of. But of course, making memories and quote-unquote having them are kind of a different thing. So if we're talking about memories that are immediately recollectable, then that's a smaller subset than that of which we can make memories. So the portion of the world that we forget grows again. But here we were talking about immediate or recent recall. And we've known pretty much since we've been able to start thinking about thinking that most memory degrades with time. So what we forget grows again if we're considering what we can retrieve or recall later on. But wait, one more thing. A lot of what we do recall or retrieve later on is corrupted by spreading activation, suggestion, misapplication of accurate memories. So the ratio of what we forget to what we don't is quite a large ratio. We are limited by how much we can get in, how much we can pay attention to, how much we can keep attended to, how much we can get into memory, how much we can get back out quickly, how much we can get back out later, how much of this happens to be corrupted, and of course all the things potentially getting in the way of our retrieval in a given moment. Even a pristine memory is not necessarily going to avail itself at 5:15 in the morning before you're even competent to stand, never mind cogitate. Memory weakness. Imagine for a moment that you come in for a study. I tell you to look at someone, and then they leave. Then I ask you to find their picture in a book of only 8 faces. I ask you to do it immediately after seeing the person. In this condition, only 60% of you will pick the correct picture. If I delay test, I ask you to do it later, maybe a couple hours later, 54% of you will pick the correct picture from the 8 faces. And interestingly, what we tend to find is that if you're given less time to look at the person, you tend to have poorer performance, i.e. lower accuracy, but your confidence goes up when you're given less time. In the DRM exercises, we learned that our brains will often go beyond the available information, introducing things that seem like they should be there. And this is generally adaptive. If you can recall a joke from last night's group chat, but you don't actually know who said it, your brain might be doing you a favor by inferring and making you believe that you know it was your funniest friend that told the joke. But this is filling in gaps. While it's adaptive, it makes us prone to errors. If I change what you expect to recall, this can change what you do recall. In this study by Loftus, Burns, and Miller, participants were shown slides of a car turning right at an intersection before a crash occurs. Half of them actually saw a stop sign in the original slides, and half of them actually saw a yield sign. They were each randomized to be asked a question about either the stop sign or the yield sign, meaning that half of them are being presented with a misleading question that misidentifies the sign type. They're then asked, after this, to choose which is the slide that they originally viewed, and only 41% of participants in the misleading information condition identified the original image correctly. In other words, the incorrect word in the question, either stop or yield incorrectly, overwrote the original memories in more than half of participants. We falsely recall things that are in line with what we or our neural networks would expect, in part because biologically, remembering something is reconstructing or reassembling the relevant details by activating the relevant neural connections that have the memory. When remembering, we actively reconstruct memories rather than passively replaying them. And since your neurons do not know the difference between activating long-term memory to update it and activating long-term memory to view it, our memories are vulnerable to being overwritten or changed whenever we are accessing them. The name for this problem, when it is a problem, is retrieval-induced forgetting. Other examples include studies of stereotype priming, starting around the 1990s, especially with child participants, where researchers suggest something generally negative about someone, allow participants to experience that person in some usually benign or neutral way, and then they simply wait for the false negative memories to pour in when we question them later on about what that person actually did. Younger children will confabulate absurd actions, up to and including the person slaughtering animals in front of them, while adults are more likely to make mistakes of important details, like turning an object that the individual was holding into a weapon when it was in fact something else. For example, turning a needle, which is admittedly an odd thing to be holding, into a gun. Since these studies are often rightly seen as quite manipulative and artificial, and because in misinformation paradigms, the researcher gives incorrect information, making it difficult to tease apart how much of the false recall is participant playing along or responding to demand characteristics. For these reasons, it's often more convincing and meaningful to give real-world examples. This example is taken from Chapter 6 of Adam Benferredo's 2015 book Unfair. In 1979, in Meriwether County, Georgia, an older woman was beaten, sexually assaulted, and robbed. To determine who the perpetrator was, the first step was to have the victim give her description of him. It was, she said, a stocky, well-built man with a round face. In the assigned chapter from Julia Shaw's 2016 book, The Memory Illusion, we learn that the eliciting of this description may itself be a threat to that victim's memory, since now she has a memory of the person and of her description of the person. And the verbal memory of the description may overwrite her actual memory of the event and perpetrator, an effect or process called verbal overshadowing. But that risk is nothing compared to what the police investigation actually did to her memory. The second step was to have the victim look at a photo book of potential suspects with relevant prior offenses. She did not identify any of the individuals in the photo book as the perpetrator. The police had a suspect and wanted to see whether she would pick him out of a 5-person lineup. The suspect, seen here in the center, was the only one in the lineup who was also in the photo book. In the lineup procedure, she identified him, John Jerome White, as the perpetrator. She identified him twice more, including in a dramatic finger-pointing moment in court. Without this identification, Mr. White would not have been convicted. The only forensic evidence was a hair from the crime scene that a criminalist identified as similar to Mr. White's hair. In his defense, Mr. White stated, "I know I didn't rape that lady." He was convicted. 28 years later, after DNA testing on the crime scene hair revealed that it was not, in fact, from Mr. White, he was released from prison. So far, this is, in fact, sadly, not an uncommon story. The majority of DNA exonerations, cases where a falsely convicted person was discovered to be falsely convicted because we went back and tested for a DNA match that came back negative. The majority of these cases were ones where the key piece of damning evidence was eyewitness testimony. This is especially tragic in rape cases where the victim experiences a terrible trauma, the falsely identified individual has their life ruined, and the victim now must live with the original trauma and the fact that her memory ruined the exonerated suspect's life. One minor mercy in the case of Mr. White was that the victim, who had been an older woman in 1979, was not alive 28 years later to learn that her memory had taken half of an innocent man's life away from him. What does make this an uncommon story is the fact that by sheer coincidence, the victim could have identified her actual attacker in this original lineup. He had been at the police station for another charge, and they asked if he would fill in as one of the foils. She passed over her actual attacker and chose Mr. White instead. Her only exposure to Mr. White before the lineup was his picture in the photo book, which she did not then identify as her attacker. Yet, the photo book exposure, combined with the lineup, was enough to replace her original memory of the offender with a false memory of Mr. White having been that offender. Looking back at her original description, which is all that we have of the victim's memory before the photo book ruined it, which of the 4 other individuals in the lineup fits the description of being a, quote, stocky, well-built man with a round face? I have yet to experience a single student selecting any suspect other than the one on the right. He fits the description. He was James Parham, and they caught him in part because he committed another rape in Merriweather after getting away with the 1979 offense. There are, sadly, even more tragic examples of investigation-induced false memories. Many of these involve false memories created in the suspects rather than the victims. A coerced internalized false confession occurs when a suspect incorrectly comes to believe, over the course of questioning, that they committed the offense. To explain the model put forward by Gunjanson in his 2018 book, The Psychology of False Confessions, we will consider a second particularly horrific case. A father, who happened to be part of the roughly 20% of the population that is suggestible, or characteristically more open to accepting ideas of others, was convinced by investigators that he committed a horrible crime. In the night, his daughter had been raped and murdered in her bed. The police could find no sign of forced entry into the house, so they suspected the father and suggested to him that he might have raped and murdered his daughter in his sleep. He eventually came to accept and believe this suggestion and confessed to the crime. Only DNA testing of the semen left at the scene later revealed that he had been innocent. His wife died of heart complications, believing that her husband was in prison because he had raped and murdered their daughter. Gunjason's heuristic model says that internalized false confessions occur when a particular heuristic is not followed. Normally, when testing our memory, we follow what Schachter in 2007 called the distinctiveness heuristic, which demands, before we say we remember something, that we be able to recall what would be distinctive about the experience. If someone accuses you of a crime, stealing a car, for example, the normal rule your brain seems to follow is to ask, do I recall what that experience must have been like? And you would likely respond with, I'm pretty sure I would remember something as intense as stealing a car, and I don't, therefore I did not steal the car. The case of the father fits this model well because, firstly, he was suggestible, which is a risk factor. But secondly, because the suggestion that he did it in his sleep gets around the distinctiveness heuristic. Yes, you normally would remember doing something like that if you were awake. So, the investigators circumvented his brain's distinctiveness test, giving him a plausible explanation, which he accepted, reconstructing a false memory of events. This is especially a problem in investigations where young people and or people of low intelligence are being questioned. But since this is not a forensic psychology class, let's get back to findings more relevant to general memory processes. Firstly, we are somewhat prone to believing that we have done something that we only imagined doing. In this study, one of the authors of which is the R in DRM task, participants performed some actions and imagined doing other actions. When asked whether they performed the actions that they only actually imagined doing 5 times, they erroneously recalled roughly 10% of the imagined actions as having been performed. The more times you asked them to imagine performing the action, the more likely participants seem to be to incorrectly recall having actually performed it. Second, watching videos of other people doing fairly mundane things like shaking a bottle can lead us to incorrectly recall having done these things ourselves. These results include and adjust for the fact that participants will also occasionally say that they performed some actions that were not even presented to them in any way, hence the presented minus not presented label in the graph. But we can simplify this by saying that we can expect people to incorrectly recall doing 10% of the mundane tasks that they only watched a video of, and, corroborating the study from the previous slide, roughly 20% of the mundane tasks that they imagined themselves doing repeatedly. But we can turn up the power even more. Liz Loftus asked parents of her undergraduate research participants to provide 3 accurate events from these participants' past. For example, they played Beethoven's Fifth at their grade 5 recital, and to confirm that the student had not been lost in a mall in the past. Then she asked participants to tell her all they recall about the 3 real instances and the false but presented as true event of being lost in the mall. In other words, she told the undergrads that their parents had told her they got lost in the mall and said, "Tell me about this event." Roughly half of research participants over the course of a few weeks provided false accounts of being lost in the mall, without receiving any specific misinformation other than "your parents said this happened, give me the details." Another version of this involved a picture rather than verbal details. Researchers acquired 4 real pictures from their research participants' parents and took one of them and photoshopped it into a hot air balloon. Participants were asked to simply report all they could recall about the event in the pictures, an interview process that followed precisely the structure used by police and social services in Canada of free narrative, general open questions, and queries about how they felt. There were 3 interview dates with roughly 7 days separating them. Here's the transcript for someone in the first interview and in this same person's third interview. First interview: "No, never actually thought I'd been in a hot air balloon, so there we go." "You mean you can't remember anything about this event?" "No, though it is me. No memory whatsoever." "If you want to take the next few minutes and concentrate on getting the memory back, something about the event." "No, yeah, honestly, no, I can't. That's really annoying." So then they gave guided imagery, instructions, picture what it felt like, blah, blah, blah. But while not saying anything, specific or misleading. You're just trying to get people to relax and think about the memory. Standard, good practice. So let's check in with this same person 2 weeks later in their third and final interview. Same again. "Tell me everything you can recall about event 3 without leaving anything out." Just trying to work out how old my sister was. Trying to get the exact when it happened, but I'm still pretty certain it occurred when I was in 6th grade at the local school there. Basically, for $10 or something, you could go up in a hot air balloon and go up about 20 odd meters. It would have been a Saturday, and I think we went with, parents. And no, it wasn't, not my grandmother. Not certain who any of the other people are there. And I'm pretty certain that Mum is down on the ground taking the photo. That's a lot of specific, incorrect details. The researchers reported that, despite only presenting participants with the photoshopped picture and only using the standard best practices of non-suggestive interviewing, 50%, this is a quote, 50% of our subjects created false childhood memories. 50%. Julia Shaw reports some even higher numbers in her studies, despite having a pretty high bar for what she calls pure false memory.
So this is my first meeting with the participant.
So the other event which your parents reported happening was when you were 14 years old, you initiated a physical fight and the police called your parents. So
Honestly, I don't remember. I don't know what you're talking about.
I'd like you to relax, close your eyes, and focus your attention on trying to retrieve this.
Okay. And so by the time we get to interview number 2, we're seeing a different story.
Remember, like a verbal fight, and maybe I seems so unlike, but maybe I pushed or something. I feel like she pushed me first.
Okay. And this person is starting to picture how it could have happened. And what could have been turns into what would have been, turns into what was.
So by the third interview, the memory has taken hold.
I think the cops showed up and we were kind of having maybe a verbal kind of fight, and then it kind of maybe got to a push.
Shaw was able to convince over 70% of participants that they committed a crime.
I think I just lost it. Couldn't take that anymore.
Keep in mind that this does not mean that everyone has a 50% or higher chance of being duped. The risk factors from Gunjinson's heuristic model would come into play here, making some of us more susceptible than others, according to traits, states, and contexts. This is our introduction to confabulation, making stuff up. People with memory impairments and split brain patients who are cut off from knowing the cause or reason for why they engaged in an action, usually one that we told them to do, will create elaborate and entirely incorrect justifications for their actions and recall reasoning processes that never occurred. One point of this course is that confabulation inventing memories of causes and reasoning after the fact, is a key part of how your brain normally works, even though we rarely experience it that way. A lot of your reasoning actually occurs after decisions and behaviors have been made. We could label the two types of false memories that we've covered confabulations of your brain without overstretching the concept. We confabulate our misinformation-based false memories, thinking that we actually saw a yield sign or saying who found us at the mall, and we confabulate our DRM-type false memories, where, responding to cleverly motivated spreading activation, we apparently misinform ourselves. In either case, one's brain has made or confabulated the memory. Lastly, we come to schemas. A schema is a cluster of knowledge representing something and used for something. What it represents could be, quoting Stephen K. Reed, a general procedure, object, precept, event, sequence of events, or social situation. And what it's used for could be interpreting sensory data, retrieval of memories, organization of behaviors or actions, and solving problems. By this definition, schemas are schemas for things. They are how we not just associate or remember, but how we understand. Our schemas help us make sense of what William James, writing before schema was a term, called blooming, buzzing confusion, that is, our complex world. We need knowledge in order to get knowledge. Parts to make wholes, foundations to make walls, buildings to make cities, definitions and meanings of words to make communicative sentences, or to make sentences communicative. Without schemas, we would never be surprised by anything. A barking cat with 5 legs would just be another object. Schemas provide us with default knowledge of things that can be used to develop expectations, organize the world, and think and act effectively based on these expectations. We are comfortable in the world to the extent that our schemas help us to navigate it. Piaget referred to situations where our schemas prove ineffective as disequilibrium, and said that this feeling motivates us to update our schemas or accommodate apparent contradictions within them, which are usually only pointed out to us by conflict between the schema and reality. Next lecture, we will have a look at the application and violation of our schemas. Stay tuned.
And that's the end of that chapter.